Today's Daily Data is about a new meta-analysis published in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin that looked at sex differences in moral reasoning. As we'll see, sex differences in moral reasoning have a long and controversial history in psychology. This new research not only sheds light on these differences, but also may explain part of why men and women have different political beliefs. For several decades, moral psychology was dominated by the theories of a man named Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg argued that a mature sense of morality meant deciding moral questions by using objective, impartial, and impersonal moral principles. Then in the 1980s, a researcher named Carol Gillen accused Kohlberg of having an overly male-centric view of morality. Gillen argued that Kohlberg's impersonal view of ethics was only typical of males. Women, by contrast, judge moral questions based on interests that are personal to them and based on who is most vulnerable. These two senses of morality were aptly named the ethics of care and the ethics of justice. This view of sex differences in moral reasoning did not fare well over the years, though. In 2000, a meta-analysis of 113 past studies showed that there were sex differences in how much emphasis people placed on justice and care, but that they were small. Since that time, moral psychology has changed tremendously. Part of that change has been an emergence of the dual process theory of moral reasoning. Central to this theory is the distinction between deontological and utilitarian moral thinking. Utilitarian moral thinking judges the moral worth of an action based on its consequences. Thus, a utilitarian would say the lying is okay if it is for a good cause and brings about a good outcome. Deontological thinking, by contrast, judges the moral worth of an action by determining whether or not it is consistent with some context-free rule, such as lying is wrong. Now, in the past, these two kinds of reasoning have been thought of as representing two different ends on a continuum of one common variable. But according to dual process theory, this is wrong. Instead, these two kinds of thinking are seen as completely independent psychological mechanisms. They may be related. The degree to which a person engages in one or the other can change the moral choices they make, but psychologically speaking, they are distinct, just as seeing depth and color are. The contextless thinking that characterizes deontology is thought to be based on a strong negative emotional reaction to certain actions. It is an instinct or an intuition rather than the product of deliberate reasoning. Utilitarian thinking, by contrast, is thought to be a more cognitive form of moral reasoning. There are a few lines of evidence that point to this conclusion. First, making people feel happy in labs makes them more likely to pick utilitarian choices when faced with moral problems. Secondly, having people do cognitively demanding tasks while they answer moral questions increases the probability that they will pick a deontological answer to the moral question. Thirdly, having people make moral judgments very quickly causes them to make more deontological answers. And fourthly, brain regions associated with emotions become more active when people engage in deontological reasoning, while regions associated with reasoning become more active when people engage in utilitarian thinking. The emotional nature of deontological thinking made some researchers suspect that women might engage in more deontological moral reasoning than men. This is because women are generally more emotional than men. Previous research has shown that women experience emotions more strongly than men, are more easily persuaded by emotional arguments than men, and can identify emotions in others more easily than men. Even though there has long been interest in sex differences in moral reasoning, only one previous study had tested this within the framework of dual process moral theory. This new meta-analysis filled this gap by re-examining the raw data of 40 past studies on 6,100 participants who answered moral dilemmas that made people choose between utilitarian and deontological options. These dilemmas typically involved harming one person for the benefit of many. For instance, many participants were asked if it would be justified to go back in time and kill Hitler before he started the Third Reich and all that. In this case, the utilitarian answer would be yes, and the deontological answer would be no. The study found that men have a much stronger preference for utilitarianism relative to women, as was predicted. This was shown to mostly be because women engaged in more deontological reasoning than men. Men and women engaged in utilitarian thinking at very similar levels. The study also found that women tended to rate moral dilemmas as being more difficult than men. This suggests that women, like men, understood the utilitarian motivation behind the consequence-based answers, but felt severely conflicted between this reasoning on the one hand and their deontological emotional reactions on the other. According to the study's authors, all this boils down to women having a stronger negative reaction than men to the idea of doing something that harms people. An important limit of this study was that it only looked at moral questions that involve harm. Thus, it did not tell us much about sex differences in moral judgments about things like sex or a person's duty to their family or community. Still, the sex differences in tolerance for harming others that this study found may explain some of the political differences between men and women. Surveys going back decades have shown that women are less likely than men to support war. Similarly, surveys show that women are less likely to support the death penalty than men. This study suggests that it is possible that these policy differences are rooted in more fundamental differences in the moral psychologies of men and women. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see a new video about a news study 6 days a week, consider subscribing to Daily Data. And if you want to help our videos do better in YouTube's search engine, or you have a study you want us to cover, consider leaving a comment.